Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together. Hey friends, hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And as I say every week, this is a very special episode because this episode is connecting us with Khensani Mohlatole from Johannesburg, South Africa. She is the creative genius behind the ClothesMinded podcast, as well as the Hanger Management blog. She is a fantastically creative fashion thinker. She is an artist and a creative overall. And I am so grateful that she has taken the time to join us today from Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome, welcome, Kensani, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. And thank you for that really beautiful intro. It's like absolutely amazing. I'm super excited.
You are very amazing. Exactly. And we are excited and grateful. So can you talk a little bit about your sewing story? How did you get started sewing? How did sewing come into your life? Is this something that you have always done? Did your family do this? How did this become something that was part of what you do?
Actually, no one in my family, I think maybe one of my aunts sews, but wasn't really something I grew up around with. We did, my mom and my dad are frequent tailor visitors. They're both very serious about getting dressed. So it was a very normal thing, like growing up. A lot of our things would always get like tailored and altered to fit us better. But it was never really a thing that I thought I would get into. But when I was in high school, I was getting really into fashion, but more from a like sort of fashion media. And then I started getting into secondhand clothing and like thrift shopping. And around that time, I was like, oh, it'd be really fun if I could also alter a few of these things, or I could, do some things here and there and make them like a bit more fun or modern or update a lot of these much older pieces of clothes. And I don't know how, but I got my dad to buy me a sewing machine. I knew nothing about it. I just was like, can I get a sewing machine? And he was like, sure. And then I tried to teach myself to many, many failed results. And then I decided to go to fashion school where I learned a bit more formally. And then I dropped out of fashion school and then didn't sew for like 2 years. I just found that I did not enjoy it in fashion school. Like I absolutely hated it. I was like, this is the most miserable activity ever. I don't see why anyone would do this. Then the pandemic happened and I had so much free time. And
yes.
we stay with the partner, and his parents have this beautiful, their house is almost kind of like a museum. They have so many books and artworks and things. And we started looking at like all these historical images and stuff. And I was like, I would love to wear that. I would love to know where this comes from. Or also, especially for me, like what's the equivalent of like of all of these things here where I'm from. And then I just started sewing again. And then I started to like it more because it also became this sort of exploration of like my own culture and identity and history, especially things that I wasn't finding anywhere else. I think that's also what I didn't enjoy about fashion school as well. At a very, and I think most of the schools here still do have a very Western Eurocentric approach, particularly to like fashion history and stuff. And then ever since then, I've just been very, very obsessed with sewing.
Well, and we are grateful for it because we get to look at the pictures of the amazing garments that you have made. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your approach to fashion. And I think it is true that sometimes that formal education, especially when these things are structured around Eurocentric ideals and principles, are not going to feed the soul of everyone.
Absolutely.
And so your curiosity, rather than being, sparked at fashion school, it kind of became a little bit more crushed. And you were less excited, but you were able to rekindle your curiosity when you looked back through South African history. Can you tell us a little bit about going back to the past and looking at some of the historical costumes or trying to develop a historical understanding of what South African fashion was for Black women in the past, in the distant past. What kind of things surprised you as you were looking that way?
I know. I think the first one was realizing that there was a history before, like, the 1940s. Um, it's not. It was never really common for me to come across a lot of like images, especially of even just women in general, but then especially of any Black women. That sort of predated like the 1940s, sort of at the start of apartheid and stuff. So that was also just. It sounds very silly, but it's like just not something you see very often. And to think about the fact that there was a history before this time, and there was also a history before like the colonialism and the settlers and etc. And there's been so many amazing, interesting things I've found or I've gotten the chance to discover. There was like there's a lot of like I believe the correct term for this is like indigenization. So for a lot of what
Hmm.
we as contemporary South Africans feel like are our traditional cultural garments, a lot of these are often colonial byproducts, or they're things that have had to change their material, their form through hundreds and hundreds of years of like settlers and colonization and trade and stuff. And it's been really interesting tracing all the different ways those happen. And you also see a lot of I think fashion has been this really cool place where you see where a lot of women try to reconcile like keeping hold of their identity and their culture, but then still having to exist in this very either like white supremacist or rainbow nation context. Like one story I really
Hmm.
enjoyed was so young men when they go for initiation, and that's when they like become a men and they get circumcised and they go like deep into the mountains and stuff. Their mothers, and I think it's their mothers, like will prepare clothing for them to wear before that. And there's these instances of these like Western pants, like slacks that these guys would have to get because they would also after that they probably have to go start working in cities and stuff. But the woman would beat them in like this traditional style, and it's this beautiful blend of like the two different cultures. And they're really fabulous actually. Like they're quite stunning, and they fold all kinds of embroidery and beading, and I think also sometimes the boys also did it themselves. But I just feel things like that are really really cool. And then there's also this like trove of images I keep coming across more and more of like Black women in like the Victorian era and the Edwardian era. Many of them unnamed, of course, but you see them, which in the beginning was quite like a new thing for me, like dressed the same way you would see like any sort of white Victorian woman, etc. And it's also
Hmm.
just interesting to see like the kind of like grace and pride that they carried themselves with. And also there'll be instances where people will bring in like animal hide as like a wrapper or a shawl or something while they're still wearing like a this big poofy sleeve blouse and this like walking skirt and stuff like that. And again, just sort of like this beautiful tension and like conflict between these two sort of identities that I just find very intriguing.
That is fantastic. And what I appreciate about what you're having us think about is when we look back at the past, we can definitely connect the dots to kind of draw some connections between that distant past and to where we are today contemporaneously. And I remember in reading your blog, you have a really beautiful definition of what fashion is or what African fashion is. And I know that there is a lot of, because of colonization and just because of white supremacy, these really rather shocking claims that folks might make, like something like Africa has no fashion. That I think that was one of the name of one of your episodes, and that feels incredibly shocking and offensive and all of these things. How do you respond to that? Or do you even feel like such a claim merits a response?
I definitely would want to respond to that because I think it's a great opportunity to just also just help someone also just realize this amazing textile history that's all over the continent. I think that a lot of that idea comes from, I think, especially in modern times, there is so much of all this like clothing production that happens outside of the continent. And I
Hmm.
also found that there's also this idea of like Africa sort of being a dark continent, or there never having been like language or any sort of like
Oh.
sense of education or anything or history existing before like settlers. Is that because a lot of that exists in cloth? That was sort of the medium. Um, so like the quote, I think it's El Anatsui, he's a Ghanaian artist, and he said like, so cloth is to Africa what monuments are to Westerners, and you see it across the continent where a lot of
Mm.
the storytelling, if it's not in some sort of oral tradition, like it is laid out in the cloth, the meaning that's the text itself. And I think it's even better than a monument because you also get to live inside it. you get to wear it. Like that's kind of cool. You get to embody like your actual
Yes.
history. And you learn so much, I think, about every different kind. I mean, this is true all over the world, but I think particularly for Africans, you can really learn so much about like people's beliefs and their value systems and their economies and who they traded with and their language through the kind of cloth they make and the kind of textile traditions they get into. And they're all very beautiful and unique in their own ways. And they also share these beautiful thorough lines that I think still exist to this very day, which is fantastic. And I would never ever deny myself the opportunity to lead someone on a very long rabbit hole about that.
It's like, oh, you said that horrible thing. Let me show you the millions and millions of ways you are completely wrong.
Absolutely.
I love this question of the cloth as monument, because what it seems to connect for me is the relationship between text and textiles. Like there are some folks where history only exists in things that are written down. That is an incredibly limited way
Mm-hmm.
to imagine the past. That it has to somehow be in a book. Therefore, if it's not, then it's not real. But as you said, that the cloth allows you to live within it, that you can have it and wear it. And I wondered if you could to share a little bit. I think you talked about this before with Tebe Magugu's post-colonial take on luxury, and the way that Tebe's work went back and looked at some of these quote unquote traditional elements. I think you were talking about the shui shui inspired fabric that they made that had their mom on it, I think. So could you talk a little bit about these character fabrics? And these are textiles that actually have images of Nkrumah on it from like the from the Ghanaian independence. Can you talk a little bit about these kind of narrative, I guess maybe narrative fabrics or storytelling fabrics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've mostly known them as called like commemorative cloth as one of the names.
Okay.
And from what I understand, especially I think it was a very big tradition in like West Africa, especially, but you also have it across the continent. But just sort of celebrating any sort of like political figure or sort of his important historic event through cloth, and then combining them with these beautiful designs. So something Tebe has done. I think he initially began it with images of his grandmother. And some of the matriarchs in his family, who obviously have been very monumentally influential in his work. And you can see, because he's like, that's a designer that really knows how to design for women. And I think part of that has been influenced and raised by women. And you really see that love in his clothing. And I know recently he's also started allowing his customers to do their own custom versions. So any person you want to have on the cloths. And those things, I know like a really big one, like my mom used to tell me they used to have the Nelson Mandela ones when like we were in 1994 post freedom. And it was just this huge symbol of pride. And you got to walk around. First of all, like, there was this very big sort of resurrection of like traditional fabrics like post 1994, and on top of that it was in the context where like we have a black president and we have freedom, and you just get to wear that and you embody that and everyone can see like the kind of things you're experiencing. There's so many amazing different like cotton specifically, but like these printing and weaving traditions across the continent. And I think perhaps in the past it might have been a bit more abstract or like figurative, where now we need to have more of the technology to really have these more literal presentations on the cloth. But I think it's pretty much in the same vein as what you would have seen like a long time ago, where it might have been like a beaded figurehead or something, or like crocodiles if maybe that was your family's totem. But really just getting to almost like like how you have like sigils in like Game of Thrones. You really just you wear
Right.
your country, your family, like this badge of honor, which is really cool.
And it's so beautiful. It really is beautiful. And it does exactly what you're saying about the cloth as a form of monument. And it's a clear visual representation because it's this image. And at the same time, there are also other fabrics that might not necessarily narrate a story or have a particular image on it, but yet they also hold generations and generations of meaning. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the controversies, if they are seen as controversies. I know, for example, there was a film done by a Kenyan woman called Wax Print, and she talked about wax print as a form of, I think she called it a hybrid cloth, that people think it's African, and that many African women who are selling or designing it have, been able to make the Nana Benzes have been able to make a lot of money and to kind of generate intergenerational wealth for their families. And yet the copyrights for all those designs are held by the Dutch to this day. The Dutch. And so how African is it? I don't really know. I don't know. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that, though we know that wax print is a West African question, but I wonder if shwe shwe or some of the other cloths that are seen as native or indigenous to your region have the same challenge. Hey friends, hey, I know you're enjoying the audio version of Stitch Please, and thanks so much for listening. But you're missing out on all the great stuff going on behind the scenes. That's why I'm inviting you to join our Black Women Stitch Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can see all the video versions of the podcast. Plus, you get some amazing swatch cards. You know how much I love these swatch cards. Look, see how cool these are? Oh wait, you can't see them because you are not yet on the Patreon. So when you join the Patreon, you'll be able to see this, me showing you these amazing cards. We also have some great perks at the other tiers, like discounts, swag, office hours, and more. Don't be the last sewist in the group now. Head over to patreon.com/blackwomenstitch or click the link in the show notes and become a Patreon supporter today. We truly cannot do this without you. So thank you so much. How do you define what an African fabric is?
That's a really good question. And it's very funny because I was actually having like a heated argument with someone the other day. So like shwe shwe is like a lot of people call it like the tartan of South Africa. But very similar case as like your Ankara, like your Dutch wax prints where it's actually originally like the technique of printing the fabric is Indonesian. And when
Yes.
the Dutch East India Company, as they like to do, were very politely over there taking stuff and bringing it here. It was, I think it was gifted to certain royals here. And then at some point it was also forced upon people as like a mandatory thing for people to wear. And then it eventually became something that people actually wear as like a cultural symbol. And I was having an argument with someone because this is a fabric, especially for certain groups, is so tied to their identity. And they were like, you can't say that because this is a Botswana fabric and it's from Botswana and we've been wearing this for years and years and years. And I'm like, yeah, but also Botswana doesn't have like a pre-colonial history of cotton weaving or cotton trading. So where would this have come from before? And I think it's very sensitive for a lot of people because it is something you hold on tightly to and you care about. But I don't think it's not. I don't think it's a bad thing if the origin is through like colonization or through trade. I mean, we have this huge beading culture here in South Africa, but the majority of the beads we use now are all plastic beads, which are sort of descendants from glass beads. Which again brought over here, not something we actually manufactured ourselves. And some of those were brought through like normal trade, just tit for tat bartering situation, and some of that was through settler colonialism. But we've still managed to transform it into our own like design languages and make it all our own. And I think there's also a beautiful value in that. And it's very interesting because there's a lot of different kinds of cotton fabrics that are quite essential to different ethnic groups in South Africa. But from what I understand, outside of like Southeast Africa, like the very top of the country towards the east, like as close as you can to Mozambique, there wasn't a lot of cotton production happening below that. So before that, it would have been like animal hide. I think there are some instances of like using bark and grass and things like that as well to weave and make fabric. But also again, if you think of like groups like the San and the Khoi who were very nomadic, they wouldn't have really been doing a lot of weaving because who's going to carry a loom everywhere?
This is very bulky. Yeah. We're going to have to leave this, but listen, we're not bringing this next time. Sorry, it's just too much.
Exactly. So like I know with the San, they worked a lot with animal hide and they do amazing things with animal hide, and they were making their beads out of like ostrich eggshells and wood and seed.
Ooh.
Very cool work. But it's also a lot of things was like it's what they had. It was light. It was in their natural environment. And the only instances I've found recently of sort of like cotton weaving is so in Southeast Africa. So actually My mom's side of the family, which is Tsonga, so that's sort of where they're from. They had
Hmm.
access to the weaving industry and sort of from East Africa to Southeast Africa, so Mozambique, Tanzania, as you go up the coast that way. And
Hmm.
that's why they were one of the first sort of South African groups that were working with cottons. And then I think probably through a combination of trade and then different settlers, etc., it spread out through the rest of the continent. And I mean, cotton, I think anyone will know, is a lot easier to work with than leather and animal hide. So that also just makes sense for its adoption. And since then, obviously, a lot of different groups have come up with their own unique prints, or there's actually quite a lot of Asian influences on our prints here as well. Like there is
Hmm.
like a traditional Tonga fabric, and my one friend and I was talking about it, but it's got a very like the sort of design language is quite Indian. And from what I've
Oh.
understood, there was also quite a bit of trade, with a lot of different Indian traders, and also the Dutch and whoever bringing Indian stuff here, and it got very popular with the locals because some of it is very similar to like some you'll see some like sort of Indian and Indonesian sort of like design styles. They're not too far off from a lot of things you'll see from like other actually indigenous like from the continent, like either embroideries and styles. So it makes sense that perhaps this is why they were like quite popular, or why they were quickly adopted if they weren't being forced upon people. Which I think is a much more interesting
Mm.
story as well, because it's not just a celebration of your own identity and culture, but it's also this beautiful link across the world that also perhaps put in place by a bit of colonization, but there's a link there that's above that. And so we're sort of united in our experiences of oppression, but also like our experiences of creativity and art and beauty. And I think that's beautiful.
Yes, yes. No, I think that's so important because I think, at least here in the US, we talk about, as descendants of enslaved folks, intergenerational trauma, but we also need to talk about intergenerational gifts, our intergenerational joy, that we don't get to be here as expressions of who we are right now if everything that came before us was relentless oppression, right?
Absolutely.
It was relentless oppression, but it was also mitigated by style, by how we chose to wear certain things. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I think you described this as the sumptuary laws, certain things that Black women could not wear in like the 1790s. We had similar laws here in the American South in the days of slavery. Honestly, you can tell white supremacy is a total myth when you look at all of the apparatuses that they need in order to keep the story going. Like, oh, wait, no, you can't wear this. You can't have this handkerchief. No, you cannot use this particular. I'm like, really? If y'all are so supreme, why do you need every little thing to be tweaked toward your advantage? So, talk about some of these laws that folks broke regularly in the 1790s.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, that's very funny. Yeah, it's just. um, So okay, so this is a little bit tricky also, just because the sort of like conceptualization of race in the 18th century, like here in the Cape Colony, was a little bit different. So for like the Dutch, anyone who wasn't like, so if you weren't like Dutch, Christian, and I think something else, you were kind of technically considered black. So the sort of free black people that we're referring to in this time, and these would have been people who were either prisoners who were brought over from other countries, so or then they were let off their sentences, or they got to work here, or there were people who were either born into slavery or lived in slavery, and then they got special emancipation, but only for them specifically. It wasn't widespread. So certain people who get
Hmm.
manumitted, maybe if your slaveholders really liked you or treated them a good service. Like there's a story, actually, one of the richest women ever in the Cape Colony, I think in the early 1700s, was actually a black woman from Angola. And she got that way
Hmm.
because her dad was able to buy her out of slavery because he sold out some other enslaved people. Um, so yeah, very complicated layers there.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So she thrived.
Yeah, no, she
So she
thrived.
thrived.
She got to be one of the own some of the most land. There's one of the wine farms is like her descendants, I think. But yeah, that's a community story. But to the sumptuary laws, so these were applying to. So these women would be either African descent or Asian descent, and I think some of them could also be like Eastern European. Might have checked that last
Hmm.
time. The women of African descent were usually from Madagascar, Angola, lots of different parts of East Africa where they were capturing slaves. Um, Indigenous South African people, or the people indigenous to the Cape, that's types of the Khoi and the San, they weren't technically allowed to be enslaved, but they weren't treated in a way that wasn't not slavery. Um, But on a technical
Aha.
level, they weren't enslaved people, so they didn't really fall under this classification. So it was a lot of these East African women, and then also Asian women. There's quite a big population of Malay people, Chinese people, Indonesian people, etc. And this, I think there was about like 110 of them around the 1760s that were free Black women, and they were either married to, or they were merchants of their own, or they were seamstresses. And also a lot of the women that were brought in from Asia as slaves here were often brought in because of how skilled they were at needlework, at embroidery, at sewing. So you can imagine these women already
Yes.
come from a culture of like very great style and this wonderful understanding of putting things together. And now they're also in the
Right.
economic position to afford to look nice. And from what I
Mm.
understand, like the Dutch Cape Society, it's a bit different from a lot of other societies. There's a bit more freedom of movement for most people, even for women. Like I believe women can own
Oh.
property and stuff. So there's a lot of like upward mobility. So it's really easy for it. Kind of bit them in the ass because it became quite easy for a lot of people to start doing really well and then looking really well. And of the like I think 110 women that they were there in this colony, and mind you, there's like thousands more living free settlers, living their best life, and they were just really not happy. A lot of the women of like the Dutch East India Company, like the wives, felt like they were being surpassed. They felt like these women were dressing above their station. They were either equal to or above them in style. And then you can also see it from the kind of things that these women would then be banned from wearing. So things like they weren't allowed to wear silks of any color. I think they were allowed to wear black silk if they were well behaved, whatever that means. And I think for like certain religious ceremonies, so if there was like a baptism or a wedding, they could wear a colored silk. They weren't allowed to have like any super fine lace anywhere in their bonnets, on their clothing. They were restricted to, I think, only wearing chintz and like very plain or striped linens. What else? No real or fake jewels, which is so funny.
Wow. How dare you have adornment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what if somebody might accidentally realize that you're a human being? You can't have that. Like,
And you said this was 110 people.
yeah.
All of these laws were designed to manage 110 free Black women.
Yeah.
It wasn't even that many.
At all. Like I think
but
they were such a small part of the population, but they clearly caused such a huge fuss.
They caused a huge fuss. Or were these people, they were deluded and they needed everybody else to be deluded as well. You know what I love? This is something I just you mentioned the jewelry point, and I love this when you said this in your episode, because for some reason, I don't know why this never occurred to me. But you were talking about like fashion and clothing and how that relates to issues of social class and race and identity and colonization. But then you said jewelry serves no purpose. Jewelry is 100% decorative. Jewelry it's all symbolic. It's all symbolic. You might have a ring if you are married, but for the most part, earrings and bracelets and stuff have no function. And I was just like, I mean, I'm not a big jewelry person, I don't think, but I don't know why I thought that was so shocking. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between and I don't know if the larger story is who gets to have extra? Who gets to have excess? Who gets to be told you can only wear chintz and this linen, or at least for us in the U.S., as descendants of enslaved folks in the American South, it was called Negro cloth, and it was a form of denim. All of these things, I'm just like, it's an illusion when you have to create all of this apparatus around something that should be neutral as fabric.
Yeah.
But how do you think that shows up, or do you think that still is a thing when we imagine what is luxury and who gets to have it, and the difference between what luxury communicates and what is a necessity, etc.?
Definitely. Oh my God, that's like a thesis on its own.
I know. See, now you got to go back to fashion school again. Just kidding. I wouldn't put you through that, Kensani. I mean, you've done nothing wrong to me. I don't know why I would force that upon you all over again.
It's also interesting that you mentioned Negro cloth, because it's also similar to something that we also had here, which I still don't know what the pronunciation of this is because I've only read it, but I think it's called Selampur or Salampur. Also very similar fabric, like it's a cotton, quite coarse. And it was quite a lower quality fabric that I think a lot of Europeans, I think only lower class people in Europe wore. And at some point they got to move on to better fabrics. And then they brought it here, and it was a very big thing as well for like Africans to wear here as well. It's also interesting because it's also, I think they still found ways to make it look really beautiful and excellent. And like,
yes,
we run into
yes, exactly. It's like, we can't make these people ugly. We just can't do it. We have laws. We say they can't wear fine lace and they can't wear silk of any color. And look, they're still beautiful. Yeah. What else can we possibly do? Listen, if you got to make everybody else ugly just so you look beautiful, you need to investigate yourself and maybe stop colonizing so much and settle inside yourself instead of, getting on ships. Look within. Look within.
But it's interesting, the sort of the status of like luxury is always so interesting, because I think, so this is something I've spoken a bit about before, but like if you look sort of, this is like this like sort of through line with a lot of different African fashions. Cloth has always been a bit of a status symbol, and obviously like the finer or the more beautiful the cloth is a status symbol, and also obviously like what it's made of. Those are costs things that we understand, or like what make a luxury item. But also I think the way a bigger thing is also like the labor that goes into it. Like you get these stories of like they would import silk into like West Africa, like some of the finer silks, and the makers they would take those things apart thread by thread. And then they'd mix it with their own things and they'd reweave it in their own way, and then they'd create something even better and cooler.
Wow.
Which is also amazing. And I think a lot of the Europeans that were like selling this were so confused at this, because they're like, the silk's already amazing. Like, what? You're like, why are you tearing it apart?
It's like, wait, this is not a bunch of threads. Don't do that. No, just use it like it is. It's like, I think we can make this better.
Like the fiber's lovely.
It's like, remix. Exactly. You thought it was good, and we are going to make it great.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to do. Yeah, we're going to make it so great that you can't recognize it anymore.
And then it's always like a case of something I always see is like the more cloth you have as well as like this beautiful status symbol. So like if you look at a lot of like historical, traditional like African garments, like they're always huge. Like it's just fabric, lots and lots of fabric. And
like a lot of fabric. Like yards, meters and meters and meters of fabric, so much fabric.
Yeah, like so there's like the Tsonga skirt, it's called the Shebelani, it's made for dancing, or also Tinguvu. It is sometimes like 50 yards of fabric in one skirt. And this is something that like every girl is supposed to get when she's like becoming a woman, and that's like 50 yards per person, like in one skirt. Which is like, and
now is that
beaded and embroidered and decorated, like it's so wild.
Wow. And so are these garments treasured garments that get passed down? Were they meant to represent like, oh, we'll use a lot of fabric so that this fabric will be something that you could have for later? Or is it also just purely, celebratory, decorative, beautiful, to be admired, but not to be deconstructed later or anything like that?
Oh, no, I think it's definitely a bit of both. I think there obviously are some things that are a bit more sentimental, but you also see, and this happens like across the continent as well, where, also because you are working with like 50 yards of fabric, for example. I think with most indigenous cultures anyway, like you really understand that things take time and effort to make, and you don't interact with the earth as something that you just only take from. It's something you also give back to. So a big waste, not culture. And you have also like lots of beautiful instances where perhaps like the cloth that your mother had gets handed down to you, and you might refashion it a bit for whatever's going on in your time. Or perhaps there are certain like symbols or like designs and motifs that maybe your mother had on like a wrapper, and then you get to also add yours onto that, and then it also sort of becomes like almost like a family quilt of sorts. And that keeps getting sort of used over and over again. Like my one friend always says that like there was a time where you wouldn't really call, I think, any sort of like makers like designers in the African context, just because like the knowledge or your design inspiration or like the things you're using, they're so dependent on your entire community and also all the people who came before you and all these techniques. Like you don't exist as like this individual creative. You are to quote Kamala Harris, everything before and like everything that's now. It's very collective sort of approach to design, which I think is kind of missing sometimes in that Western context, where it's always like, no, I invented this and I was the only one who made this and that's it.
No, exactly. It becomes this idea of like, I think the phrase you used was a design language. And we start to learn that this language is not the language of individual, but that like all languages are cultural. They are all cultural. No one single person is responsible for the vocabulary of a nation. That in the same way, no one single person is responsible for a culture.
Yeah.
And what you've described is such a beautiful mixing of voices. It's that multiplicity that you describe that is so important for African fashion. And you just do such a beautiful job of that, sharing that with us. I can't believe this, Kensani, but we are getting close to our time. And I have to ask you the question that we ask all of the guests of the Stitch Please podcast. And it is this. The slogan of the Stitch Please podcast is that we will help you get your stitch together. Kensani, what's that?
I love a good pun.
Yep, girl. Yes, same. We are very punny over here. Khensani Mohlatole, what advice do you have for our audience to help us get our stitch together?
Ooh, okay, this is a tough one because I barely feel like I have my stitch together. But you know, those who can't do, teach. I would say, I think, you know what is a great thing? I think every time you are wearing something, anything, whether it's even something you've made or something someone else has made or you bought at a store, I think just take a moment every day you get dressed, you know, just to, you know, take a little breath and also just be thankful that, you know, a pair or several pairs of hands went into clothing you today. And maybe just extend a little sort of gratitude to them for being able to, you know, help you be warm today or protected from the rain or covered from the sun or to feel really beautiful. And that now you and all these other unknown hands are like sort of linked by this garment, and they've sort of kind of watched over you in a bit, and they've sent you a little blessing. And you get to carry that energy forth for the rest of the day, and you can go put that out in the world and do whatever you need to do. And just remember that you're not alone, even if you're like me working from home all day. Like there's always a little bit of someone else like around you or with things you're wearing, and I always find that quite comforting.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Kensani, thank you so much. This has been a real joy. Now, where can folks find you out in the internet streets? Where can we find you?
Cool. Yeah, I'm on Instagram at okbaddyk. Then there is my podcast, which is called ClothesMinded, and that's clothes like clothing. And I believe that's on wherever you get your podcasts. I have a Substack newsletter, Hanger Management. TikTok is also the same as my Instagram at okbaddyk. And those are my usual hangouts. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. This has been a real joy. I hope we get a chance to talk again another time, but this was really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. It's been an absolute honor to be here. I love the show. It's been super, super great to talk to you. I wish we could go for like 3 more hours, but thank you for having me again.
You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.